Hello. What a lovely time of year it is, isn't it? Mince pies, lights, gifts, and Santa Claus. Ooh. All I need now is a mug of hot chocolate and a roaring fire, and I'll be content to settle for a week. But is it all a facade? Is Santa Claus a fake? My name is Ian Currey, and this is Thinking Out Loud. Come on, let me tell you what I think. Christmas is a lovely time of year, isn't it? Do you have special traditions that your family enjoys? At our house, it's one of the very few times we have soft-boiled eggs with toast soldiers at breakfast time. Most days at our house, breakfast is a rather less structured time. I'll be grabbing something on the way out, on the way to the airport, and Robert might be waiting patiently for pancakes. At about the same time, I'm wondering about lunch. Growing up, soft-boiled eggs were somehow a thing on Christmas morning. But because we had socks filled with gifts from Father Christmas, the breakfast table was a jumble of lovely things that really don't go well with soft-boiled eggs. Father Christmas was much more of a thing when I was a child. He's quite like the much more commonly depicted Santa Claus, but there are some key differences. Santa has elves and makes toys and rides in a magical sleigh, while Father Christmas seemed more serious, and he left fruit and nuts and candy in our socks, but not the bigger gifts associated with Christmas these days. The traditions and origins of the two are fascinating, and to a small child, somewhat confusing. Now, right about the time when we were being taught not to talk to people we've not met, to not let people we don't know into our homes, and not to accept candy from strangers, along comes Santa Claus. And somehow then, everything's okay. My personality causes me to question everything and check things out for myself. And as a child, that was no different. At a very young age, I can remember questioning the storyline. Santa Claus and Father Christmas were getting their stories all mixed up, and I was struggling to unravel things and get beyond the "you have to go to sleep or he won't come to visit" thing. But how would he know if I were awake or not? He'd have to visit to check that out, surely, and then if I were awake, I'd see him. My logic was flawless. Oh, I was good. A plan had to be hatched. I'd pretend to be asleep. I was smart enough to know, though, that I couldn't do that if I was tired. What if I took a nap with my younger brother and sister? Then I'd be fine. So that's what I did. Sound asleep in the afternoon with my baby brother and sister. Christmas Eve came along. Socks were placed at the foot of the beds. Lights went out, and off to sleep we went. Now that wait seemed like an eternity. But then I heard a creak on the step, and the door latch opened, and in came Father Christmas to fill those socks. And now, as soon as he reached for mine, I sat up and said, "Hello, Father." Father Christmas talked to me. He said words I can still remember all these years later. He pointed sharply at me with a strangely familiar gesture, and he said in a stern voice, "Don't tell the others." That encounter had me asking myself a lot of questions. What had I actually been told? Had I been told something that wasn't true, or had I filled in the gaps with the story with what everyone else thought. Was I ever actually told Father Christmas came down the chimney pot and had reindeer that flew at supersonic speeds around the world? What I believed, what I thought I'd heard, even though I'd never been told such things, somehow added together to make a story that matched what everyone else seemed to accept. Confusion in a small boy's mind was pushed aside and the default version accepted until that night. Now, years later, I wondered why it took me so long to figure things out. My parents had never actually told me the things I believed were true, but at the same time didn't directly contradict those ideas either. There was room for confusion, and that was quite all right. From my point of view, the fact that socks were filled with things I liked was the final deciding fact. The socks were full. The question was simply how they were full. But that process wasn't important when chocolate was involved. What would be the advantage for my parents in letting me believe the strange things I believed about Father Christmas, rather than destroying quaint traditions? For a start, the full force of responsibility attached to parenting only became useful information to me much later in life. Why hit a small child with that needlessly? The wonder of the gifts, the seeming magic of traditions, all took second place though, once I fully understand what the giver of those gifts had sacrificed in the process of caring for me and my siblings all those years ago. The harsh reality of life for a few moments was glossed over by the wonder of a little boy with a sock full of chocolate and fruit who was slowly figuring things out for himself. There are a lot of ways to look at this, and plenty of disagreement amongst some of my friends. And the disagreement is about the real message of Christmas, getting lost in the process. But before we decide to ditch the fables and traditions, I must say that there's a good number of similarities with certain real life stories too. The dirt, stench and squalor of a stable 2,000 years ago are hardly reflected by the idealistic "the cattle are lowing" at a cute baby in a manger with "no crying he makes" having to be the line in any carol that makes me smile the most. Anyone who's ever had to meet the demands of a small new baby will know exactly what I'm talking about. My parents wisely introduced me to the harshness and reality of life, one small step at a time. As children, if we'd been introduced to everything all at once, can you imagine? Oh my, we have to go through all that to be grown-ups? Let's don't and say we did. Luke, in telling the story of Jesus, has some interesting observations along this line. Luke starts out in his writings by telling us he's going to write an orderly, accurate account of events. Luke records a lot of the details along the way, but doesn't let us know the end of the story too soon. It's just the way Jesus did things too. The disciples had been sent out by Jesus to visit surrounding villages to help the sick, and so on. But although that sounds like something that's very normal and was simple enough, that's because we already know who Jesus was, don't we? At the time, that wasn't clear at all. When Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, heard about everything Jesus was doing, he was puzzled. Some were saying that John the Baptist had been raised from the dead. Others thought Jesus was Elijah, or one of the other prophets risen from the dead. "I beheaded John," Herod said. "So who is this man about whom I hear such stories?" And he kept trying to see him. I love that "I beheaded John, so it can't be him" thing that Herod comes up with. In the next few paragraphs, we can read about Jesus feeding 5,000 people with a few small loaves and fishes. And then right after that, Jesus left the crowds to pray alone. Only his disciples were with him, and he asked them, "Who do you people say I am?" And here comes the list of strange ideas and people filling in the gaps in the story for themselves. Well, they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah. Others say you are one of the other ancient prophets risen from the dead." Then he asked them, "But who do you say I am?" Peter replied, "Well, you're the Messiah sent from God." And here's where I see Jesus doing exactly what my father did when he was discovered that long ago Christmas morning. Jesus warned his disciples not to tell anyone who he was. Don't tell the others. But why wouldn't Jesus want people to know who he really was? In the next few sentences, Jesus goes on to explain the ruthlessness of the life he was to face: suffering, rejection, and eventually death. At the time, right there, right then, the idea of being mysteriously fed from a basket of small fish and loaves of bread, well, in much the same way I was fed with chocolate and fruit from a sock, was more important than the harsh reality of life and how that would play out. Looking back from where we are now, knowing how our lives would unroll because of the sacrifices of our parents, we can be grateful for the gifts we've been given. Not so much chocolate and fruit or toys, but the gift of life perhaps, or the promise of a secure future. Now, of course, we can perhaps understand something of what was required to bring those remarkable things about. In just the same way, we know now the wonderful story of Jesus and how that played out. But not just the cute Christmas card Jesus, the real one who knows how to give good gifts to his children without us even being fully aware of who he is. Now, once we do know and accept who he is, it just gets better, doesn't it? We appreciate him for who he really is. Now, back to our question of the day. Is Father Christmas real? Oh yes, he's real. He's just perhaps not who you thought he was. Until next time, goodbye.